So I made this brief video in part because I created some slides that it's just a bit of extra help that I hope is helpful for everyone. And I just want to go through them together now because we didn't have time to go through them in our previous class. So these slides are already available in under Learn at PolyU. So when you have the time, please have a look through and browse through them on your own as well. So the practices that we're talking about are good for writing practices, as true of academic writing, but it's also good for other genres of writing beyond academic writing as well. I think of a good paper as having good structure, and I think of good structure as sort of like a house. I think the strongest papers will have a foundation with which to build upon. It will have scaffolding walls to basically build on their argument, and it will have a roof, something that might safeguard your paper against possible scrutiny or counter-arguments. Now, a quick review of our assignment instructions that have been available in Learn at PolyU since the beginning of the semester as well, is that this final paper is generally meant to help us share a bit about our understanding of different sociological concepts and ideas that's covered in the readings and the lectures. And I hope everybody's been keeping along, not just with the lectures, but also the readings. And the paper is an invitation for us to articulate an argument as well. And that's going to be really key to developing your paper. And in addition to substantiating an argument, this means using evidence to basically help support it. So a good way to think about structure is you might start off with an introduction that also talks a bit about your argument, gives an overview of what's going on with your health issue, and segues into a bit about your argument that you're going to share with the reader. Then you're going to move into describing your context about your health issue and perhaps the policy of choice as well. Then you're going to talk a little bit about the literature. What have we found about a given issue? And bring in some of those concepts from our class. Then when we move into analysis, this is where you can present your application of these concepts that you're drawing on to a given health issue. How does it help us understand a certain health issue or even a certain policy and its connections to it? It's also important to also incorporate evidence here. So how are you demonstrating that your argument is true? You're always trying to sell and convince the reader that your position is true against all others. And finally, a conclusion to wrap up everything that you've essentially touched upon in this paper, in addition to your argument. So let's go through them one by one. So your introduction should talk a bit about your chosen topic, much like how you would think about a sales deck, or much like how you would think about a book or even an academic article. When you start off, when you read the first chapter or the first section of a paper, it's always going to introduce the reader to the chosen topic that you want to talk about. It will also talk a bit about the context for this issue. Why did you choose the issue that you did? In other words, why is it important? Basically, you're trying to convince reader that they should care about it, that this issue you've chosen is important for whatever reasons. Then give an overview of your argument. What is it that you're going to be doing in this paper? What are you going to be arguing? And essentially, you're going to be demonstrating the significance of your argument and as well the significance of your chosen topic. Now, a good paper will always have a strong argument, and in life, as in writing, you are always selling. You're always trying to convince somebody of something. And in this case, you're trying to convince the reader of a position that you've taken on a given topic. So Some prompts for thinking about developing an argument for your paper are, and you don't have to choose them, but these are just prompts for you to get thinking and to get creative. Perhaps you can think about whether or not the policy you've chosen is effective or not. And if it is, why or why not if it's not effective? Is a developmental issue or the goal basically something that your policy responds to relevant? Do you think that the policy adequately addresses whatever issue you've chosen in terms of health? And why do you think this is the case? You can also think about making your argument a bit about a theory or perhaps the concepts that you're drawing on. So if you chose a given theory to analyze this issue, talk a bit about your theory, explain it, and talk about how you're going to apply to understand your chosen issue or policy and your connections between the two. So, what is your theory telling us that's new about this chosen issue and policy? And if you want to draw upon concepts, this is also the same opportunity for you to do the same thing. And remember that a theory is basically a toolbox, a system of different tools, in this case, concepts. So your argument should be going through how you would use these tools to develop an original insight, some original argument about your chosen policy or issue or goal. Now, when you move into a context section, and it doesn't um, your structure doesn't have to fully follow the structure here 100%. If you want to move some stuff around, like your argument, you want to move that into the context section or so on, that's up to you. But the structure that I've offered in the instructions is just a general guide to hopefully get you thinking into incorporating a structure that helps your argument flow in a way that makes sense to the reader. So for your context section, this is where you should talk a bit about perhaps your policy that you've chosen. What is a history of this policy? Who's implementing it? And what was sort of the motivation behind it? Talk a bit about the background of the chosen health issue that you have and how it might be connected to your policy. So some examples that I've given here are suppose someone has chosen, let's say, the one-child policy, then they might analyze a health issue focused on, let's say, high fertility rates and poverty alleviation efforts back in the 1970s. And this was basically the health issue that was facing China at the time. And knowing this health issue, this is what basically the government decided to respond with, this policy of a one-child policy. Then you should also talk a bit about your literature review. What do we know about this issue so far? You're always trying to position your paper in the context of other literature. So place your paper in conversation with other scholars. What have other scholars found? And this is where you can introduce a bit of your concepts as well in fleshing out how your paper is going to be different. What concepts are you going to choose to analyze your issue? What are they? And how might you apply them? And all in all, you're trying to build connections between your policy and your health issue, and maybe even your concepts. And then we move into the meat of your paper, which is where you're actually analyzing your paper, analyzing your issue with evidence as well as theory. Now, more important than what somebody knows is how they came to know it. So this is why evidence and analysis is so important, because it's what distinguishes opinions from arguments and facts. That when somebody says climate change isn't real, the burden of proof is on them to actually bring up the evidence to prove it. And this is the only thing that separates opinion from facts. We know, because there's a lot of evidence that shows climate change is real, that climate change is in fact true and real, and it's not basically a fiction. You should be thinking about the same thing, and the burden of proof is also on you to bring up the evidence to prove whatever argument you want to make. So, what did you find? Present your evidence. This can be evidence from the literature. This can be evidence from other sources as well. Consider what data sources could be important as well. Think about if you want to draw on evidence from other sources, think about the type of data that it is. Where are you getting it from? What year is it from? Is it collected by the government or somebody else? Why do you think this addresses the issue that you want to address? And you can think about different types of evidence here. You can think about perhaps interviews that are done by others, or you can think a bit about quantitative evidence like using census data. The government regularly releases a lot of data related to its census that is also freely available for us to have a look at. And as you write your analysis and your evidence section, you should also be thinking about those connections. Come back to your argument and build connections here between the evidence you're presenting, your argument, and the concepts that you're using. So how does this evidence prove that your argument is indeed right? And perhaps go further. If somebody were to rebut or counter your argument, what might they say and how might you address it? Some food for thought. And finally, when you move into the conclusion, this is where you wrap things up. This is where you give a recap, a review very briefly of what the issue you looked at was, what your argument was, and what the evidence you presented was, and why ultimately your argument holds true. Talk a bit about how your unique take on this issue really makes a contribution to the issue or to whatever policy you've chosen, for instance. And a good type of practice actually is with something called signposting. Now, this is a creative writing technique that's important in a lot of genres of writing. This is true for academic papers. This is true for corporate communications. This is true for organizational communications from hospitals and even the chief executive. They're always going to be writing about what they are going to do. Signposting is literally thinking of a signpost on the street if you're driving or if you're walking by that literally gives you the direction to someplace and tells you where you're going. This is exactly what signposting is in writing. This is where you will say, this paper will accomplish this by doing this, or I will argue this using this theory that I'll prove with this evidence. And this is good practice because you're not trying to write a mystery novel. The reader shouldn't have to pick up a flashlight and look for your argument somewhere buried within page 7 of your paper. That you should be thinking about this and doing this for the reader so they can follow along and understand your argument and the flow of your argument throughout the entire essay. Also think about drawing those connections with your argument again. And the entire essay really is about taking a position, taking an argument, and convincing the reader of the credibility of that position. And last but not least, I want to remind everyone to abide by academic integrity guidelines. This means following the guidelines that have been laid down by the university, avoiding plagiarism, and the course instructions as well. Please have a look at the course instructions and some of the prohibitions and things to keep in mind there. I want everybody to write their own original papers using their own creative thoughts without the use of plagiarism or even external AI tools. That I want everybody to be writing their own papers so that I can read your own thoughts about this. In any case, this was a longer video than I expected, but I hope that this is helpful and thanks for listening, and I will see you next week.